So storing winter vegetables. I store mainly potatoes and carrots and onions, sort of the basic foods and flavors for winter in my cold storage. I also use my cold storage to store canned goods and some other vegetables. With potatoes, we planted our seed potatoes fairly shallow in raised beds and also in the in-ground garden, just in mounded up soil. So the soil is fairly loose and it's easy enough to just dig them up by hand, so we don't have to do any forking over or major digging to get them out. It's just a lot less effort and energy that way. I'll insert some photos here of the process that you will have already seen if you have followed us on Instagram. Basically, we planted the potatoes just 3 or 4 inches deep, and then once they had sprouted and come up out of the soil, I had mulched it with a layer of grass clippings. And you just do that to keep the tops of the tubers, the potatoes themselves, as they grow, from receiving any sunlight. If they get sun on them, they'll turn green. So don't worry about it too much. If you have a potato that's green, I would say just cut off any of the flesh that is green, and if there is flesh remaining that is white, you can use that part. That'll be fine. It's not affected. No, that's just from my experience. And always do your own research if you're really concerned about it. I have never been harmed by eating half of a green potato. So that's how we dig them up, and we basically then bring them into a dry place where they can dry off. So they're naturally covered in dirt. Some people wash them off. I don't do this because it takes them a lot longer to dry out after the fact, and that period of moisture on the skin leaves them open to more bacterial activity, fungal activity, and other things that can affect their storage. So I tend to just pull them out of the ground. If there's a little bit of extra dirt on them, you can rub them off at that point. But I tend to be very gentle with the potatoes just as they're coming out of the ground, because the skin is very fragile when it's freshly dug, when the skin has not been exposed to dry air yet. Now, if you have been digging up your potatoes and the soil has been very dry for a very long time, you'll find that the potato skins are probably already fairly hard and dry. And you can tell when this is, if you rub your thumb against the skin of the potato sort of fairly firmly and the skin just slides off of it, then you know the skins are still too tender to put in storage. So we'll take them in, and I just use my garage, but you can use a space in your basement if you have one, a shed, basically just somewhere where rain can't get at them. And then you want to cover them with something that will exclude light. So we use a tarp, but we also have a fairly dry climate, and so even with the tarp laid over top, just loosely, to allow air to just sort of move easily underneath the tarp, we leave our potatoes like that for a couple of days until the skin is totally dry and the dirt on them, if there's any left, is dry. And then you can sort of rub off the excess dirt and put them away. I'll insert some photos and maybe some video here of that process. Now, when I was doing this, the potatoes were still a little bit wet, and so you'll see that the dirt isn't coming off very cleanly, and really it's a little bit too early to have done this part, but I wanted to show you just how we do it. So I ended up only packing some of the larger potatoes in the box when I know, because they're so large, the air will be able to pass through them in these big crates that I've built out of reclaimed material. There's lots of gaps and slats in the bottoms and sides of these crates, and with the big potatoes, because they don't fit tightly together, there's lots of air movement through there. So I can put those in my cold storage and know that they will continue to dry out and harden off in the cold storage. That won't be a problem. But I left all the smaller potatoes out of the bin for now, and I actually left all of the purple potatoes out as well, just because it's a lot easier and better to do it once the soil and the skins have completely dried off. So as far as potato storage, we store all the larger and middling sized potatoes in our cold storage. Any small potatoes that are just like quite small, what you would see as a baby sized potato in a grocery store, and also any potatoes that have soft spots, worm damage, if they have water cracking. I'll put a picture up here of a water crack. If they show these things and you sort of press your finger against them and the spot is still very firm and very hard, then it's probably fine to go in storage. It's evidently healed. If you find a bit of worm damage or a water crack and there's a give underneath it, if you press against it and there's some softness underneath, then I'll sort that aside and put it in a separate bucket for immediate use. So what do you do with immediate use potatoes? Well, I'll often in the fall cook up a big batch of mashed potatoes, and I'll freeze them in portion sizes that I can just take out quickly during the winter. If I need a very quick meal idea, I'll just pull out some frozen potatoes that are already mashed. You just have to microwave them or heat them up slowly in the oven. And then I'll have like maybe some pre-made, pre-cooked meatballs that I'll pull out of the freezer as well. Put some gravy on that, and you've got a meal very quickly. So that's what I do with the potatoes that you need to use up right away. They're not going to last in storage. They will keep for a couple of weeks probably, but I won't try and store them long term. With my carrots, I do something a little bit different because carrots need a relatively high humidity. They prefer a humidity of greater than 60%, and they'd actually probably prefer something closer to 80%. Our house gets very dry in the winter here. I would guess we're anywhere between 15% humidity and 24% humidity through the winter in most of the areas of our house, including our cold storage. Now our cold storage might be slightly more humid than that, just because the potatoes are probably giving off a little bit of moisture as they get older. Potatoes do keep better with a little bit more humidity in the air. And if your area is quite dry like ours, then you'll notice that your potatoes will the skins will start to dry out and the outer edges of the potato will get a little bit more wrinkly through the year, and that's just a drying out process. That's quite normal. With the carrots, if they get too dry, they'll sort of become bendable. You don't want a bendy carrot. You want a carrot with a nice snap and crunch. You can cook with the bendy carrots, but they're not really great for fresh eating, and they start to lose a lot of their flavor once they start to dry out. So in order to give them high humidity, I'll put them in a bucket lined with a garbage bag. And I'll just stick all the carrots in, pointing straight up so that they're easy to pull out one at a time. And I'll top it with a soil medium. Now, I bought this peat moss before I understood how unsustainable peat moss is, so I do not recommend using peat moss for this. But you can use any potting mix, really, something that can hold moisture and that isn't going to sort of drip into your carrots. You want to pre-moisten that soil medium and just layer it on top of the carrots. And then you can, depending on your humidity level in your home, you can close the bag more or less to allow it to breathe a little bit. And that'll help keep the humidity around the carrots really consistent. And you just want to check on that soil every month or so through the winter to make sure it's not drying out too much. Or if it is feeling and smelling too wet in there, you can leave it open for a while to allow it to air off and dry out a little bit. So that's one way that you can manage moisture around carrots. That kind of technique will work for a lot of vegetables that need a high humidity. So that'll also work for your rutabaga and your beets and stuff like that. I don't tend to grow those things in a large enough quantity that I need to do that. I do have some rutabaga this year that I might do that with, but we'll see. In addition, I'll probably keep my onions in my cold storage room. They're not quite as picky. The most important thing with onions is to have sufficiently cured them. So as soon as you see the tops knocked over in the garden, and for us this year, this happened because a storm came through and all the onion tops got knocked over. And I went through the garden and pulled out every onion who had the top knocked over, even though that onion was not a mature size. That might seem like I'm cutting off my harvest, but the problem is that once the onion tops are knocked over, it doesn't matter what caused it. The onions then consider that, or treat that like it's a signal to stop growing. And so if they stay in the ground and they stay, especially in really moist conditions, you'll get root rot, you'll get root maggots, and they will not cure properly if they have too much moisture after this period of dormancy begins. So I took all my all my tomatoes, I'll get the right word, all my onions, carted them into my shed where they will not have any direct sun on them. But the shed gets fairly warm during the sunny days. And I just hung them with a string on the inside of my shed. And I left them there for a couple of weeks. And you really want to do this in a quite warm place if you have that option. If not, room temperature inside is probably your best bet. You want to keep them dry, you want to keep light off of them, and you want to let them get nice and warm. You do not want to smother them with anything because you really, really need those tops to dry out entirely. Once the tops are totally dry, then the bulb is in a dormant state and it will last much longer that way. What I'll then normally do is just lay them in a single layer in a cardboard box, and I'll put them in my cold storage at that state and then just check on them every now and again. And if you notice a couple onions getting soft, you can pull them out and either use them right away or you can chop them up and freeze them, and that way you don't lose them entirely if they do start to get soft. You'll notice I also have a spaghetti squash in my cold storage. That spaghetti squash has actually been in my cold storage for 2 winters now. This year, it's actually 2 years since it was put in my cold storage. With squash, you need to make sure it is fully hardened off before you put it into any sort of cool keeping area. They do like it dry, but they need to be hardened off or they will basically just very slowly rot in such a cool, cool environment. So with most of my squash, pumpkins, and winter squash, storage squash and stuff like that, I will let it completely harden off upstairs in a bright location. If they get direct sun, that's even better. You just want to make sure that the stems are completely dry, that the skin is hard to the point where if you press your fingernail against it, it will not puncture the skin, but rather create a bit of an indent. And you want the squash to be the full color of whatever color it's supposed to be at maturity. Once it's at that stage, you can store them in the cold storage. Now I do this with my spaghetti squash because they like it particularly dry, and I try to keep it drier downstairs than I do upstairs. I try to humidify the environment I'm living in for my own sake. Whereas most of my pumpkins I will actually keep just on display around the kitchen dining area of our home. And that is a good way to remind me to eat them and to cook with them. I have several pumpkins still from last year's harvest, and they are showing no signs of rotting. You just want to keep an eye on them, and with the wetter types of squash, like the pumpkins and the butternut squashes and stuff like that, I like to keep them where I can see them because they have more moisture inside of them. They are more likely to get soft spots and mold on them, and you just want to keep an eye out for that if you're noticing any mold spores on your pumpkins, my recommendation would be to wash them down with a mild vinegar soap solution. And you basically are just trying to kill any mold spores. If there are any on the outside of your pumpkin, but it hasn't gotten through the skin, then the flesh is still okay. You just want to wash it down really well, and then cut away any areas that were exposed to that mold or fungus or whatever it was. As far as other garden vegetables, what do I do with them? How do I put them up? I can and pickle a lot of food, as well as blanching and freezing a lot of the foods that don't can particularly well. So I'll can tomatoes, and I will can obviously cucumber pickles and zucchini pickles. This year I'm also going to be canning some carrot pickles. You can pickle just about any vegetable, and it's the pickling liquid that provides enough acidity in order for it to be safe in a water bath canner. I do not have a pressure canner, and so I don't do any pressure canning, and I don't store non-acidic vegetables or fruits in that way. So with those things, so with peas and corn and beans, kale, these things, what I'll do is I will take them inside, wash them off, blanch them for about 2 minutes in boiling water, take them out, put them immediately in fresh cold water, and then I will chop them up. If it's beans, I'll chop them into whatever size I want to keep in the freezer. I usually chop some really small for putting in soup, and I leave some whole for just quickly throwing in a pan, sauteing with some butter and salt and pepper, maybe a little bit of garlic, and that's a really good side dish. It's really, really quick because you just have to basically reheat them, get a little bit of color on them, and you're ready to go. I'll also, with the carrots that are really knobbly looking, or if they're quite small, I will often have a large bucket of carrots that I don't put in the cold storage because they're not in perfect condition, or they're not large enough to keep. With the carrots that you see I've put in the storage, they're all fairly uniform, fairly large size carrots, and because they're larger, they can maintain their moisture levels better and they store better. So with the small carrots, if they look really nice and they're great, then I will have a big bag of them that I just keep in my fridge. That is just basically for fresh eating and snacking on. I also plan to pickle some of these if they're sort of small and good looking and straight enough to fit in my jars. The really gnarly, knobbly ones I'll tend to cut up, cook, and then I'll freeze those just in a sheet pan or any sort of flat dish so that you can break them up and put them in a bag or container, so you can scoop exactly as much as you need out at a time. And you can also do that with, you can also freeze sliced chopped onions. I chop my spinach and just put it directly in the freezer. I don't bother blanching it. It's tender enough, it doesn't really need a two-step cooking process. So frozen spinach, you can just pull that out, put it in your frying pan to saute it off, put it directly into your soups. Or if you do smoothies, you can put it in your smoothie raw like that, and it's not a problem because it's a fairly tender leaf. Brassicas. Now, this year I have grown broccoli. Broccoli does not keep well in the fridge, so when it is ready to be picked, I'll pick it and I'll blanch it and freeze it the same way I do with the beans and the carrots. With cauliflower, you have a little bit longer. I haven't actually grown cauliflower myself yet, but they do store in the fridge for a little while, for a couple weeks. I think you're probably safe. Then you could do the same thing, blanch and freeze, or you can pickle. I'm interested in growing some cauliflower next year for pickling, because I think it would make a lovely addition to a mixed vegetable pickle. You know, some beans, some carrots, some cauliflower, maybe some peppers. That'd be great. With cabbage, I'll tend to peel off all the outer leaves when I harvest them, and then just wash it, cut off any damage that the bugs have done, wash it really well, make sure there's no like cabbage maggot things in there. That's just gross. So I'll try and wash it really well, try and clean it really well, cut off any damaged areas to make sure there's nothing hiding in there. And then I will put those in my fridge in a closed container, buckets or bags, with, usually I'll throw a paper towel in there, and that's just to maintain a relative humidity without it getting too sweaty in there. If lots of water is sitting against the cabbage, against a plastic surface, that is a vector for bacterial growth, so you don't want that. In that way you can keep cabbage for a really long time. Last year I had, I think, 4 cabbages. They were fairly small, but 4 cabbages that I kept in my fridge. I would have picked them in September and I still had a good condition cabbage in my fridge in February that I used up. To recap, you want to maintain a humidity level around certain vegetables, like root vegetables. I use that bucket and soil mix method with my carrots and my sweet potatoes, and I leave my potatoes just out in the open because they usually, the varieties I'm growing, Alaska Bloom, and I actually don't know what the purple ones are called. They're just sort of a family passed down potato seeds. So they're both pretty good storage varieties, and they can handle a little bit of a drier climate and usually will keep fairly well. You want to handle the temperature. I have a fan that draws cool air from outside into the cold storage, and you can buy a small, I think it's called a thermostat, that will run the fan only until it gets to a certain cool temperature, and then it'll shut the fan off. That's a great idea. I haven't got mine set up yet, but I want to set that up for my cold storage so that it doesn't freeze, but I can also maintain a cool temperature without running downstairs to unplug and replug in the fan whenever the temperature rises. If you are wanting to increase the humidity in your cold storage, you can leave a bucket or a shallow pan of water just sitting out in your cold storage to naturally evaporate. That'll increase the humidity a little bit, but it won't be extreme. And if you find your cold storage is too humid, you either have a dirt cellar or something else like that, you can run a dehumidifier in order to remove a certain amount of humidity from the air. Some things do not store well in a very humid environment. Other than that, it's basically good curing and good common sense. Trying to remember if there's anything I've forgotten. That's been this week's video on storing winter vegetables. I can't speak for every possible situation, but I can explain what I do in my situation. Hope this has been helpful, and I hope you have lots of luck and bounty in your harvests this year. See ya.